Hi students, here is Professor Ali with the narration for one part, the first part of the lymphatic immune system. So you might be wondering why this organ system has sort of a hyphenated name, lymphatic immune. Well, it's a bit historical. We always knew a lot about the lymphatic system. The immune system, some information was known. But in the late 80s, after a lot of molecular biology was, being used to help us figure out genes, what proteins they code for, technology improved, we essentially learned a lot more about the immune system, and really it is an organ system in its own right. And I would say that the lymphatic system is part of the immune system rather than the immune system is part of the lymphatic system. Today in medicine, we have specialists who are immunologists because that's a study of the immune system, the field of immunology. So there are, specialties in medicine for the immune system. There's no such thing as a specialty for the lymphatic. So most of the time we hear about the lymphatic in relation to cancer diagnosis and lymph nodes. But for this narration, I will begin with the lymphatic system, cover it, finish it, and then we will look at the immune system. And again, like any organ system, we divide it into sort of three parts: a first line of defense, a second line of defense, and a third line of defense, because our immune system is supposed to protect us against infectious agents like bacteria and viruses. So in this narration, I will only cover the first line of defense and the second line of defense. And the reason for that is the third line of defense is a little bit more complicated, and so I will have a separate narration for that one. So let's get started. So in this image here, what you see is an individual. We see lots of sort of green lines. And one of the first things to realize is that wherever we have blood vessels, arteries, veins, capillaries, we also have lymphatic vessels. So lymphatic vessels are the transportation network that is used by the lymphatic system to move a fluid called lymph. So the lymphatic system is made up then of lymphatic vessels. There are also structures called lymph nodes, and if you look closely, you would see what appears to be circular, but they're more bean-shaped structures, and one of them is enlarged here for you to see, and that's called a lymph node. And we have an abundance of lymph nodes throughout the body. In certain parts of the body, for example, around the armpit, the axillary region, there are a denser amount of lymph nodes present compared to, let's say, somewhere here like mid-arm. The other feature that you want to appreciate from this diagram is the lymphatic system does include some structures related to the immune system. So for example, the thymus. This is not an organ that you hear a lot about, and yet if you are unfortunate enough to be born without a thymus, you will probably not live very long. I won't tell you why now, but you will find out later. But there's the thymus. It's usually superior to the heart, and it's a very important organ for the immune system. Now, we will be discussing what these organs actually contribute to the immune system. Here we also see the spleen. So the spleen is lateral to the stomach. So your stomach usually is about somewhere here, and the spleen is in this location here. And the spleen is also a major lymphoid organ. So we refer to these organs as lymphoid organs, but their role has to do more with the immune system. We also see bone being shown here. And you might be wondering, well, why? What is a long bone? Now, if you remember from your study of the skeletal system, a long bone has, towards the epiphysis, it has spongy bone. And within spongy bone is something called red bone marrow. And red bone marrow is where hematopoiesis occurs. And you should know that fact because we would have talked about hematopoiesis when we were discussing blood as a topic, because this is where all the blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, this is where they are all produced. So that's why bone marrow is shown in this diagram. And the heart is also included because there is a connection between the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system. Now, the other structure that we see here shown are the intestines. And so what does that have to do? Well, we will wait for that one on the slide. So this diagram will show up in another slide later in the discussion. So I wouldn't talk about all that's happening, let's say, for example, in this image here or this image here. For the introduction, I will keep it simple. So that's what you want to know. What are the lymphatic vessels? You know, what's a lymph node? What does it do? And for the lymphatic organs, what is their role? So as it says here, lymph nodes and glands, organs, such as the spleen, thymus, intestines, tonsils, they contain lymphocytes. So if you are not sure what a lymphocyte is, you need to go back and look at the flow chart or the breakdown of all of the formed elements in blood. Because as I've been saying to you in these narrations, much of the information that you are learning, you will need to be able to recall it in future, topics. So this is a good example now of what lymphocytes are. These are white blood cells, and in particular, they're not just any white blood cell. They are what is called a T lymphocyte and a B lymphocyte. Only those two cells are called lymphocytes. So lymphocytes essentially reside, or they're housed in lymph nodes in these organs, not the thymus so much. I'll explain what the thymus does, but the intestines, not inside the intestines, but between these coils of intestinal tissue, there's an area where you have a collection of lymphoid tissue. And so there are 3 cell types that are really key to our immune system and the function of helping us, and that's the T lymphocyte, the B lymphocyte, and something called a macrophage. So these 3 can be found in the lymph nodes, in the lymphatic organs and glands. And so they help to defend us against infection and disease. Now you might be wondering, well, how do they do that? How T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, and macrophages help to defend us against disease is the discussion for the next narration. So I will just continue with this one. As we know, they're produced in the bone marrow through hematopoiesis, and the lymphocytes mature in one of them, the T cells actually, and that's why it's called T as opposed to B. So the B lymphocytes matures in the bone marrow, but the T lymphocytes matures in the thymus. And you already learned from the endocrine system that there is a hormone, thymosin, which helps these T cells to mature. So what do lymphatic vessels do? If we go back to what we already know, so I'll do like a little diagram here. So we know that we have cells that make up tissue. So those are cells in the tissue. And surrounding the cells is fluid. And this fluid here can be called interstitial fluid, or it can be called tissue fluid. And this fluid bathes cells. So cells are never in a dry environment. The question is, where does that fluid come from? So cells, when they're part of a tissue, and tissues are what makes up an organ, right? So we know we have blood capillaries. So let's put a blood capillary here, because this blood capillary has to bring oxygen. It transports in red blood cells. The oxygen diffuses out of the capillary so the cells can carry out cellular respiration. But in addition to all the other substances, so this is a blood capillary, so this is blood. So all of the components of blood that you learned about, that's present here. So we have plasma, which is mostly water. We have proteins, we have white blood cells, we have platelets, etc. The focus is going to be on the plasma and the water component of plasma. So if this is the arterial end of the capillary and this is the venule end of a capillary, we know that blood pressure is very high at this end here. And we know that blood pressure, so let's put an arrow upwards for high, and blood pressure is very low at this end here. Because remember, this is going to drain to a vein, and veins have the lowest pressure. So this is the venule end. And so as blood is flowing through from the arteriole to a venule, from an artery to a vein, via the capillary bed, water is actually sent out because of the difference in blood pressure. So water is sent out at the arterial end into this fluid here, this tissue fluid that's surrounding the cells. Now, if all that water went out, stayed out, we would have a lot of swelling happening. The tissue would become very puffy. But worse yet, what would happen to the volume of blood that's going back to the heart? Because remember, the volume of blood pumped out of the heart should be the volume of blood that returns to the heart. We shouldn't have blood pooling anywhere in the body, or fluid pooling anywhere in the body. So that water flows out because of the difference in blood pressure, high to low. There's a pressure gradient here. So at this end here, some of the water flows back in. About 95% of this water flows back in. But that 5% that's left in the tissue fluid, if that kept accumulating, again, we would have swelling. So what happens is these guys, the lymphatic vessels, the lymphatic capillaries, they are present. So this is why I said earlier, wherever we have blood vessels, we have lymphatic capillaries. The lymphatic capillaries, I'm going to change the color here to green. Their job is to drain the excess tissue fluid. So that's a lymphatic capillary. That 5% of the water that was left outside gets drained into this, the lymphatic capillary, LC, lymphatic capillary. So lymphatic capillaries drain excess tissue fluid. This is tissue fluid out here. And there is basically lymphatic capillaries, then larger lymphatic vessels, but that lymph is returned to the subclavian veins, which basically takes it back to the cardiovascular system. So now you're beginning to see the connection between organ systems. The lymphatic capillary is dependent on blood and plasma and the flow to refresh tissue fluid, and the cardiovascular system is dependent on the lymphatic capillaries and the lymphatic system to drain excess tissue fluid and bring it back to the cardiovascular system. So lymphatic vessels pick up excess tissue fluid and return it to the heart. Once the fluid is inside lymphatic vessels, it is called lymph. So if you are wondering what is lymph, this is what lymph is. So lymph is very similar in composition to tissue fluid. So in tissue fluid, you do not have any red blood cells, any platelets. You can have white blood cells because remember, white blood cells, if there's injury to a tissue, white blood cells can migrate out of blood. So leukocytes can be present in lymph and they travel wherever the lymph is going. So this is where we get to the lymph nodes now, because if we go back to our diagram, we will see that wherever we have the lymphatic vessels, we have lymph nodes, and then we have the lymphatic vessels continue, and then we have another lymph node. There are millions of lymph nodes throughout the body. So what do these lymph nodes do? So as the lymph is flowing on its way back to the cardiovascular system, because there is a collection pathway, so lymph flows in a one-way direction. It is not a loop like blood flow. Blood leaves the heart, circulates, and comes back to the heart. That is not what happens with lymph. Lymph is collected. I purposely drew this here, a lymphatic capillary, to show that it is blind-ended. They are blind-ended. They have little gaps between the cells that allow for the lymph to flow in. And those little gaps, they are sort of attached to little valve-like structures, so they function like valves. So once the lymph is in, these flaps close and the lymph can't come back out. So lymph flows in a one-way direction. As it's flowing through these lymph nodes, the bean-shaped structures, which has the lymphocytes and the macrophages, that lymph is being cleaned. These cells remove any bacteria, any debris, anything that should not be there. They remove it. So that by the time the lymph gets back to the heart, it is clean. It is going to, I'm saying the heart, but I mean the cardiovascular system. So lymph nodes clean lymph before it enters the cardiovascular system, before it enters the bloodstream. That's their job. That's what they're supposed to do. Now, there is another lymphoid organ that does exactly the same job, but it does not clean lymph. So this you need to remember. The spleen does the same thing, but it cleans blood. And at any one time, the spleen also stores some blood, and so it's considered a blood reservoir. So on this diagram here, this is showing you what I tried to draw out, so I wouldn't, spend a whole lot more time on it. Lymphatic capillaries are interlaced with the smaller cardiovascular vessels, the blood capillaries. I've already said that. Lymphatic capillaries will absorb tissue fluid that has been lost from blood capillaries. Tissue fluid is essentially water with dissolved salts and excess ions and lipids. Lymphatic capillaries are closed-ended. Once tissue fluid is absorbed into lymphatic capillaries through tiny flaps, this fluid is now called lymph. Lymphatic capillaries will lead to larger vessels. Like veins, lymphatic vessels contain valves to prevent the backflow. And because there is no organ pushing lymph along its way, so in the cardiovascular system, we have the heart. And as long as the heart pumps and pumps blood out with maximum force, that force is what sends blood along its way throughout the body. But the lymphatic system does not have a similar organ like the heart. So there's one other difference between the two. So how does lymph flow then? Well, it has the same challenge like veins. So it has valves so that once the lymph flows past, the valves prevent backflow. And just like veins, it relies on the contraction of skeletal muscles to help move lymph through the lymphatic vessels towards the heart. So you can take your time just simply going through this diagram. This is the arterial end of the capillary bed. This is the venial end. So here's where we have high pressure. So a lot of water and some ions, etc., will flow out. But the green, these are the lymphatic capillaries. And so what you see, the arrow is showing, for example, here, fluid moving into the lymphatic capillary. So that's the 5% that was never returned to the cardiovascular system. So remember that approximately 95% of the water that left the cardiovascular system at this end, at the arterial end, and about 95% is returned. It's the 5% that's sitting around here in tissue fluid that forms this excess tissue fluid, and that's what needs to go into lymphatic capillaries. So once the fluid is flowing, well, what happens? So what this is showing you is that the right side of the body, so right side, head, neck, shoulder, up to roughly the thoracic region, that is drained into a very large lymphatic vessel called the right lymphatic duct. So the drainage of lymph is asymmetrical in the body. The left side of the body, so this is the left side shown in yellow, plus the right, the lower right here, that is drained into the thoracic duct. Both of the ducts, the lymphatic, the right lymphatic duct, and the thoracic duct, sends their blood to the left and right subclavian veins. So the subclavian veins collect lymph, and being a vein, it's part of the cardiovascular system. So now the lymph is into the cardiovascular system. And this is what we mean by this statement here. This helps to maintain blood pressure and blood volume, because like I said, whatever volume of blood pumped out to the heart should be the same volume of blood that is returned to the heart. So a closer look at lymph nodes then and their function. Before lymph returns to the cardiovascular system, it has to be cleaned, removing any pathogens. So these lymph nodes appear in between the lymphatic vessels. Lymph nodes will clean the lymph using white blood cells. And so white blood cells can travel in blood. They can travel in lymph. They can stay in a lymph node. They can leave the lymph node. They can stay in spleen. So this is not a static sort of arrangement where white blood cells kind of live in a lymph node. They move in and out. They're sort of functioning like sentries in a way. But their presence means that the lymph will be cleansed before it's returned to the cardiovascular system. And so in this diagram, we see again, and actually there are many more nodes than is shown in this diagram here, but you can see one there and one there, greater number in around the armpit and also in the groin region. So those are lymph nodes. You can do the learning check. Now we get to the immune system. So our immune system is somewhat like the endocrine system, like the lymphatic system, in that, you know how for the endocrine system we had different endocrine glands sort of scattered throughout the body? Well, the immune system is sort of the same way. We will talk about the role of the thymus, the role of bone marrow, the role of lymphatic tissue, the role of the spleen. We've sort of mentioned that. So when we talk about the immune system, the easiest way to understand it is to divide it into these, what is called the barriers, the lines of defense. And so for learning purposes, we have a first line of defense, a second line of defense, and a third line of defense. And to characterize these lines of defense, for example, the first line of defense refers to all the different barriers to the entry of microorganisms. So a pathogen then is any type of organism that can cause disease. And this is a short list. These are the classification. So in bacteria, we have lots of different types. Viruses, again, we have lots of different types. Parasites, lots of different types. And fungi, lots of different types. For our discussion, the focus will just be on these two. Bacteria versus viruses. And so at the beginning of this discussion, we like to think in terms of germs. We might use the word microorganisms. But as a science student, you should know some basic differences between bacteria and viruses. And so bacteria can live on an inanimate surface, a desk, a book, your phone, our skin, inside our body, etc. And when I say live, I mean replicate, basically survive, etc. Viruses are strange. Remember, viruses are acellular. Viruses are not considered a cell. Bacteria are cellular. They are a prokaryotic cell. Our cells are a eukaryotic cell. Viruses are not a cell. Scientifically, they're not a cell. They do not fulfill the characteristics of a living organism. Viruses can have either DNA or RNA as their genetic material. There's no other thing on this earth that actually has that. So it's either DNA or RNA. HIV is an RNA virus, for example. COVID, I think, is an RNA virus. But the most important difference as far as the immune system goes is this. Viruses must enter a cell in order to replicate. Yes, some of them can live, for example, on a toilet seat, but they cannot replicate. And these microorganisms have to be able to replicate, increase their number in order to cause disease. If they can't replicate, the immune system usually is capable of knocking them off completely. But it's when they replicate to the point where the immune system can't really cope that we start to feel sick. So viruses must get inside of a cell. And a virus is really just a, DNA or RNA, whichever genetic material, surrounded by a protein coat. That's it. Some of them have a few other characteristics, like you've seen the spikes for COVID, etc. But their structure is really very simple. So when they get inside a cell, what they do is they overtake the machinery of the cell. They use the cell to make copies of themselves, and then the cell will burst, and when the cell bursts, you have millions of little virion particles now sent outside the cell, and now that can go and infect another cell. And so it goes. So if you can prevent the virus from entering cells, then you can stop a virus from basically causing a disease. That's the bottom line, if you can't kill the virus. So the body is able to detect a pathogen by recognizing something on the surface of the pathogen, something that we call an antigen. So an antigen, by definition, for immune system purposes, is again any substance that can trigger an immune response. So an antigen could be a food like peanut protein is an antigen to some people, not everybody. For some people, pollen is an antigen because it triggers an allergic reaction. But microorganisms have on their surface, even viruses, they have molecules which our body can detect. So what the immune system has to do is be able to detect what is foreign to our body. So we often speak of foreign antigens and self-antigens. So a foreign antigen is basically any molecule. And when we speak of antigens in the immune system, we're talking about things that are 9 to like 11 amino acids. Most antigens are proteins. There are a few carbohydrates that function as antigens, but most of them are proteins. So very, very small, because our cells are small. So foreign antigens are basically any molecule that does not normally belong to our own body. And that's peculiar for each individual person. Because like I said, peanut protein is an antigen to some people. You know, they can have an anaphylactic reaction to it. And then for others, you can consume peanut and you're fine. So the immune system then, these first line of defense and the second line of defense are often referred to as a non-specific type of defense. And so why is that? Well, you will see that when we speak of non-specific, we really mean that regardless of the antigen, the body makes a similar response all the time. So for example, tears. Production of tears, while that happens when we're crying sometimes, the production of tears actually, for example, if you get a dust speck in your eye, is to help flush the dust actually out. If you get something different, let's say pollen, you will still produce tears. If you get a bacteria that's trying to, set up an infection there and you produce tears. So the response, regardless of the type of antigen that's affecting your eye, the response is always the same, tears. That's different when we look at the third line of defense. The third line of defense, which includes the lymphocytes, the T cells, the B cells, and the macrophages, they pay attention to what the antigen is. It matters. So this line of defense is often called the specific line of defense. So let's take a look at what we have. The first line of defense, these are physical barriers to entry. So our skin. So our skin is actually our largest organ in the body. As you know, it covers, the exterior of the body. Therefore, it's protecting everything that's on the inside and in the deeper layers of the skin. But the skin has antibiotic properties in that the surface of the skin is actually acidic. And we also produce sebum, which is an oily substance. And while we might produce a bit too much sebum, let's say on our scalp, so we end up with oily hair, we think we have to wash it all out. Sebum is also antibiotic, but it also helps to keep the skin moist and helps to prevent hair from becoming brittle. So these are all good qualities. So overwashing of the face, the body, hair can actually damage skin. And damaged skin, as if you scratch too much or you have a cut, allows for microorganisms to get into the body. Hair also helps to trap pathogens. So we have hair actually in our nose. And that actually helps to trap small particles or even organisms, because the air that goes into our lung actually needs to be clean, and hair helps to do that. Now we have mucous membranes, and this should be spelled M-U-C-O-U-S. Mucous membranes, these are wet membranes. So they're like the ones lining the passageway, the nasal passageway, the respiratory passageway. The entire passageway is lined by a membrane, but that membrane has cells that secrete mucus to keep it moist so it doesn't get dry. Same thing with the gastrointestinal tract, the alimentary canal, our mouth, oral cavity, and all the way through the GI tract, we have a mucous membrane. And immediately beneath that membrane, we actually have lots of blood capillaries. So tears are actually part of the first line of defense. Saliva also, both of these have an antibody included in them. So I'm sure we all heard about antibodies during COVID. So they can help with as a first line of defense. You know, you taste something, it doesn't taste good, you spit it out. Lysozyme is a particular chemical. It's an enzyme that can destroy bacteria. And so saliva has lysozyme, and tears also has lysozyme in it. Other important thing is the stomach acid, which is very, very low. So typically our food isn't, you know, sterile. It's clean enough, but it's not sterile. And so any microorganisms that might still be left on our lettuce and so forth, the pH of the stomach should be able to kill them. We also have the vagina is acidic, and that helps to prevent bacterial growth. And so the barriers to entry are localized. This is an important distinction between the first line of defense and the third line of defense. So wherever the immune response is triggered, it kind of stays that way. For example, the eyes, the ears, and nose. When it says here the first line does not care about the kind of infection, that's referring to the fact that it's non-specific. It is not targeting a bacteria different from you know, pollen, etc. So next slide is just giving you some images. I'm going to move on from that one. The second line of defense is where we have some cells, but these are general cells. These are not B and T cells and macrophages. Well, macrophages do participate actually in this second line of defense as a phagocyte. Right? So phagocytic cells are very important in the second line of defense. So we have neutrophils, which we know. So remember phagocytes. If you don't remember what phagocytic cells do, see if you can find a little video. But phagocytes take up bacteria. Remember, they cannot take up viruses, because viruses, once they get into the body, they have to get into a cell. So they're on the inside. So these cells can't actually see them. So a neutrophil will phagocytize. Now it says here monocytes, largest. It's technically not true. Monocytes are part of the agranular population of white blood cells, but monocytes differentiate into a cell called a macrophage. And a macrophage, macro means very, very large, and phage means to eat another cell. So it's a macrophage. So it becomes a very big cell that is phagocytic. They use their lysosomes to destroy pathogens. So basically, if this is your macrophage, this is the bacteria. The macrophage kind of extends its plasma membrane, brings the bacteria into the cell, and these cells, phagocytic cells, have lots of lysosomes. So remember, lysosomes contain digestive enzymes. So when that little vesicle that contains the bacteria comes into the cell, the lysosome fuses with the bacteria and destroys it. Then we have natural killer cells, which target virus and infected cells. These were discovered by a lot of research going into cancer research, and so they destroy not only virus infected cells, but actually cancer cells. And what they do is they have nasty chemicals in them. They literally spray the cells, the virus infected cells or the cancer cells, and kills them. Complement proteins, these are a series of about 20 proteins that reside, they just are present always in blood, but they're inactive. And they can become activated by certain bacteria because the bacteria has a little trigger that complement recognizes. So what complement does is it coats the bacteria on the surface, and once that coating of complement, so this is complement here on the outside, that complement is able to make holes in the bacterial cell wall, and that basically kills the bacteria. We have an inflammatory response, so this is a second line of defense, and the inflammatory response is shown on this slide. So typically what we have is you've got a site of injury, and some cells that reside in a tissue is called mast cells. And mast cells are a cell of the immune system that we don't end up talking a lot about. But what they do is they release this substance called histamine. And basophils also release histamine. Basophils are not mast cells, even though that's kind of shown in brackets here. The similarity is both of them contain the substance histamine. So histamine causes blood vessels, the capillaries, to become very leaky. And in doing so, white blood cells, phagocytes, can move out and basically chew up the microorganisms. So if you ever see pus at the site of an injury, that's usually a lot of dead phagocytes. They gorge themselves and then they die. Usually accompanying the inflammatory response is redness because there's an increased blood flow to the area, swelling because the tissue area is damaged and therefore all that drainage that should be occurring by lymphatic capillaries is no longer happening. So swelling is also called edema. Heat because of the increased blood flow to the area, and pain because with all that swelling, you know, the pain receptors that are normally present in our skin or tissues, there's a lot of pressure against them, and so we feel it as pain. So usually inflammation is localized to a particular area wherever, you know, the injury or the microorganism sort of bit you, that's where it will be. So the inflammatory response can occur during an allergy attack, when you step on a sharp object or scratch the surface of your skin. So this eventually does get resolved, but one of the dangers of inflammation is now we have discovered that inflammation is really driving a lot of diseases, including, you know, there are links to inflammation to any things that you might not think of as immune system disorders, like cardiovascular disorders, where you can have an inflammatory response in blood vessels to a blood vessel that is damaged, and so forth. So this is a sort of simplified view of the inflammatory response. Take a look, read all of this, and I will see you for the next narration.